Alright, hello again. I'm here to give you the last lecture of this week. Next week I'm going to do it a little bit differently because I asked you guys a question on on Facebook about the lecture style, and a couple of you responded and told me that you wanted maybe 2 lectures a week covering half of the articles in one lecture and half of the articles in the other. So I'm going to try that for the next week, this week and next week, and you guys let me know how that works. I've posted onto Blackboard the 2 PowerPoints that I want you guys to watch. You can watch one or you can watch the other, but if you don't understand it after the first time, you might want to just go ahead and watch both. They're PowerPoints that have voiceover commentary, so you'll have to watch them and listen to them. And they cover the first 3 waves of feminism and the current wave that we're in. And once I finished reading the Stryker article as well as the Connell article on masculinities, I recognized that without a firm grounding, or at least a whirlwind grounding in the 3 waves of feminism, you'd never be able to understand what they're talking about when they talk about the different ways that masculinities have been built over time and the way that the transgender movement intersected with, or didn't intersect with, the feminist movement. So in order to understand those 2 articles, I would definitely suggest that you watch the videos or watch the PowerPoints on Blackboard, and then give those articles another go around and see if they make better sense. And then I'm going to go over some of the concepts and terminology that I found woven through all 3 of them. Woven through, I don't know, all 3 of the last articles. So I've already covered the first article in the other video, and I'm going to just kind of go over some of the major concepts of the other 3. So let me grab my textbook and see what we can get into here. The first thing I want to talk about is, I think it's, let me see what page we're on here. I'm going to go to page 85 in your textbook if you want to go with me. And this is in Susan Stryker's article called Transgender Feminism Queering the Woman Question. And what these last 2 articles do, Stryker's and Connell's, they really dive in deep into 2 different sub-movements of feminism, or, cast-off movements or companion movements to feminism, the transgender movement and then the masculinity studies or men's movement that's a little bit newer. So they're really dense. They give you lots of historical fact and detail, and both of those 2 articles, Stryker's and Connell's, argue for a very specific reading of the transgender movement and then of the masculinities movement. So what I would suggest that you do is, after watching this lecture, read those articles, but don't get frustrated if you can't understand every single thing that's being said, particularly in Stryker and Connell's works, because they are really dense, and they tend to, they're trying to intervene in a very specific theoretical argument. So you would have to have a lot of back knowledge to understand every single word, but there are long, long passages that are extremely clear and understandable, that just sort of help you understand a little bit more about what it is that a men's studies major or a masculinities studies scholar might study, or what a transgender studies scholar might study. Stryker is a very theoretically heavy text. I'm going to start there on page 85. She uses the idea of modernist epistemology, and she says several times Eurocentric modernist epistemology. Well, if you've never heard those kinds of words strung together like that, that's pretty confusing. I think that Connell does a much better job of making that idea of the Eurocentric modernist epistemology very clear, but if you didn't know what this term meant, it wouldn't matter if you understood the other article, because you wouldn't know how to connect them. And what I want you guys to start doing as we go through the weeks is trying to find the connections and overlaps in these articles. So here's one. In Stryker's article, when she says modernist epistemology, what she means is that, and especially when she says Eurocentric, what she's talking about is the way that we think about gender, which arose in like the 1400s and the 1500s, basically in Europe, and it was born there, the way that we think about the hierarchy of gender and the gender social order. And that is what they mean by Eurocentric, that it was centered in Europe when it was first originated in early modernism back in the 14 and 1500s. And so epistemology is a fancy word for way of knowing. However you were brought up, because I was brought up in a Christian household, and so my mind was trained from an early age to think of things the way that Christians think of things. So I had a Christian way of knowing. I had a Christian epistemology. I also had an Appalachian epistemology because I was brought up in the ways that Appalachian people know things, which if you've ever talked to someone from a different country, or even a different part of this country, you know that we all have different epistemologies. We were all brought up in different ways of knowing. So when she says Eurocentric modernist epistemology, she's simply saying the way of knowing about the world that arose out of 14th and 15th century European thought, right? It's still pervasive even today. It's built mostly in empire, as Connell points out so wonderfully over and over and over. He really draws this great picture of what it meant for men to build empire and to go on conquest. What did it mean for men to conquer the world, right? And what did that do to shape masculinity? He gets into the nitty-gritty details of that, and that is why that article is so amazing, because it really helps you to understand a little bit more about how men's attitudes were constructed and how those attitudes help construct women in the modernist period. So you'll hear the word postmodernist in I think Stryker uses it and also Connell uses it, but postmodern just means the period that's after modernism. And modernist epistemology is what we're trying to counteract. It's what we're trying to explode. It's what we're trying to question and interrogate and understand the validity of right now. So that makes us postmodern. We're looking back upon modernism, so we're after modernism, postmodernism. So I hope that makes sense. When they say postmodern epistemology, they're simply saying the way of knowing that came about after the modern era, when we were able to finally turn back to modernism and say, what was that all about, right? So big words that mean pretty simple concepts, but one of the ways that you can start to educate yourself and help yourself understand these articles is by Googling words like this, and even going to Wikipedia and just getting your mind wrapped around the basic concept, and then you can plug it back into the text and make sense of some of the things that they're saying. So spend some time trying to do that, especially in those final two articles that are a little more dense and a little harder to understand because of their use of terminology and jargon. The last four things I've got written down here are not specifically from pages in the textbook, but they're concepts that really go throughout all three of the last articles that we read. I think Lorber's article is really fantastic for helping us understand the concept of the binary opposition. The word binary, if you guys have heard, if you guys are computer geeks out there, you know that the word binary is used to describe the way that computer systems are built, because they're built at their bottom line. They're built on codes of 1 and 0, and that's two numbers. It's either on or off. It's either black or white. And we can already see how the idea of the binary comes to manifest itself inside of gender relations or power relations or in society. You've got a man or a woman, and up until postmodernism, never the twain shall meet. A man can't act like a woman can't act like a man, but we're starting to see that change after we're starting to question the modernist epistemology. Now that we're in our postmodern epistemology, we can question these binary oppositions and see if they hold true to our experiences and to what's actually happening in the world. That's led us in the postmodern period to really concern ourselves with exploding these categories, and all three of these last articles help you to understand. I mean, even the first article, the white privilege article of McIntosh, helps you understand that in the postmodern period and in women and gender studies, part of our objective is to explode these categories, to help people understand and to find proof for and to substantiate and to legitimize the fact that the categories that we create are socially created, and therefore the socius, the citizens, the people themselves can adjust those categories to what works best for us. That leads us into all of these ways that we've been able to look back upon what we used to believe and examine it very critically. So whereas the feminist movement, as you saw in the video in the PowerPoint lecture, the feminist movement's been going on for years and years and years and years and years to try to gain women equal access to education and to their voice in democracy and to their voice in the world. But what's happened is, because we focus so much on women, we started to believe, a couple of years back, a few decades ago, that women were the only ones who were oppressed, that women were the only ones who were involved in power struggles and power relations. But what we understand through men's studies, transgender studies, gender studies more broadly, is that all people are oppressed and all people are subjugated to these rules that they think they feel they must conform to. And so when we study masculinity specifically, we start to see the way that men are pressured to act like men. What does it mean to act like a man? Well, different things to different societies, as the articles continue to point out. And so finally, the last thing I'll say is the words that kept coming back in Connell's article. I hope that you, let me pause for a second and say, I hope that you saw through this week's readings how each one of our readings are going to build on top of one another. If had you not read the White Privilege, the Invisible Knapsack essay, the other three essays might not have made any sense. That sort of grounded what we were talking about in privilege and in hierarchization and in social orders, and we started to understand that. Well, now these other three articles are pretty dense theoretically, and this is going to form the very foundation of what we study for the rest of this whole semester. So it's imperative that you understand exactly what's happening. In a way, we're kind of forming our own hierarchy here, and this is the most important stuff. The rest of it will sort of build up and add on to what we're understanding about gender roles and gender hierarchies and hegemonic gender orders. So we've already learned the word hegemonic. We know that that means this pervasive social control over people, whether they can recognize it or not, right? And then we know that gender is not sex, it's not biological, but it's that those social roles that we as a society agree upon, or lately don't agree upon, but it's socially constructed categorizations, not biologically determined categorizations. And then order. How are we categorizing and how are we classifying people? Well, we're classifying people according to hegemonic gender rules. And what these postmodern feminist, postmodern masculinity studies, postmodern transgender scholars are really shooting for is to start breaking down, to start exploding the categories of this hegemonic gender order, and to ask questions very critically about why those categories are there in the first place, what purpose they're serving, and whether they open up more possibilities for us as human beings or shut down the possibilities for us as human beings. And so that's where these three articles sort of come together, is this whole concept of the hegemonic gender order, right? The knapsack article shows you the way that your own life might have some implications inside of this hegemonic gender order that you might have never considered. And then Lorber's article that talks about the categories themselves, how gender has been formed through societies. And then Stryker's article that really zooms in on the transgender movement and the ways that thinking in a transgender way, or even queering the gender categories, can help feminists move into a postmodern era and into a postmodernist epistemology rather than to rely on that old modernist epistemology. And then finally, Connell's article, which really examines the history of masculinity, of hegemonic masculinity, the way that hegemonic masculinity has persisted throughout the years, and the way that we've used empire building and world domination to really instill masculinity into the men, like men globally, but also locally in localities or metropoles as he calls them, but really he means just local spaces, like Appalachia would be a metropole, if you wanted to call it that. So I know I've thrown a lot at you in this lecture. There's a lot going on in these articles, but they're absolutely fundamental for the rest of our semester, and we'll continue to build upon them. So if you didn't understand everything that you read the first time, I would highly suggest that in the latter portion of this week, when you're working through that that event entry at the very end of the week, I highly suggest that you maybe reread one of the articles and choose to tackle that. Choose to help us understand a point that I haven't discussed, or a point that we didn't talk about on the doc board throughout the week. So the discussion board is the event board is wide open for you this week. Try to find something that will help us all grow as learners, but I'm kind of leaving it really open so that you guys can start to explore some of this stuff that you maybe never heard of, and some of the stuff that's still a little bit confusing to you. So I look forward to engaging with you guys on the docs, and I look forward to hearing your end of the week thoughts on the events board. See you next week.